What was it like working with Rick?
He and Russell Simmons were still best friends, and they'd been college roommates at NYU. And one of Rick's buddies, George Draculius, who was the guy who discovered the Black Crows, right? And he's music director on a bunch of cable network movies and stuff like that. Yeah, he pops up. He's busy, but he was George's sidekick. You never saw Rick without George.
Gotcha.
And it was like, hey Rick George, hey Rick George, hey Rick George. So they worked as a unit. They were one and the same. And he was his best friend, and he was also his unofficial assistant type of thing. And he had a good sense of humor. He was a light, positive guy. So those early days, I don't just remember Rick, because George was always there.
Gotcha.
And I don't think he gets enough lip service for being a part of everything. It's just Rick.
Yeah.
And I understand that, but George is a great guy. He's a hard worker, and he's got a good ear too. And Rick bounced everything off of him.
Ah.
And behind the scenes, in all the cab rides that they took back and forth, because everything in those days in Manhattan was a cab ride.
Yeah.
Subways took too long, and to get 10, 15, 20 blocks or whatever, everything was a cab ride. So you traveled everywhere together in cabs or in little convoys of cabs.
Right.
And it was easier to get them back then, because now you have to know when the shift change is. If you're too close to a shift change, you cannot get a cab in Manhattan, right?
Yeah.
If you're on the wrong one-way street and on the other side, forget about it. You got nothing. So, but back in the day, cabs were.
Yeah, it's New York.
My first four-syllable word of the day. Back in the day, cabs were ubiquitous in Manhattan.
Yeah.
Right. So you could always get one, and so we spent a lot of time in cabs together. I didn't think about it until just now, going to get food or going to a music store or going from a studio to the record company and back. And I remember seeing Russell Simmons here and there, not a lot, but they would hang out and eat at the same places, so I bumped shoulders with him. That's how I just casually run into Run DMC and LL Cool J and those guys.
Wow.
Just it was just, that's what it was back in the day, and everything was new. Walk This Way with Run DMC was just really hitting when I met Rick. The Beastie Boys' Fight for Your Right to Party the video had been shot, but the single hadn't been released yet.
Jeez.
So that's what was happening at the time.
Wow. Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah, so your release, your Danzig 1, that wasn't, that was later. That was
88.
That feels like much later. Like that, you're talking about like 86, right? Run DMC and all that, right?
Yeah, so late 86 was Run DMC.
Yeah.
I didn't meet Rick until 87.
Gotcha.
And I'm not sure. I think it was either 86 or 87 when that Beastie Boys thing hit. I remember because I was I was in the studio with Rick and we were watching it, and he was telling me that he was trying to sign Slayer off of EMI or something, and he got Kerry King to play the lead parts on Fight for Your Right to Party. just the sleazy little whammy solos.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that's cool, And at first they weren't sure how it was going to land, because the Beastie Boys were the Beastie Boys, so they were kind of selling themselves as these middle-class white rappers, and it was tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah.
And Rick was playing some rhythm guitar on it, and another guy that was a friend of Rick's was playing guitar on it, and I have no idea who was playing the drums. I don't know if it was an early T808 drum machine or if somebody was actually playing it live, but it was, that horrible loose sound. That, and the same time was it the King of Rock and Roll was out or coming out, so all of this was in that early period.
Sure.
So Rick had rented a little, it wasn't a brownstone, but it was just a tiny little 2 or 3 story unit on Elizabeth Street down in Greenwich Village. And that was Def Jam Records. It was a narrow, long, deep building like they have down there. And everybody was crammed on 2 floors. You know, the A&R people were on the first floor and accounting was on the second floor. And our main point of contact was also a college friend of Rick and Russell's, Renee Palome, and she was his main assistant and our main, now they would call it a handler.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if we needed to go to a doctor, call Renee. If we need to set up a rehearsal, call Renee. You know, if we need gas money, call Renee. If we need a reference for an apartment, call Renee. You know, everything was call Renee. She got us paid. You know, it was that whole thing. So the early experience, everything was new and it was fun. And my first evening that I spent with Rick was actually after my first audition. We went and had pizza down. We took it down to the studio at Electric Ladyland he was recording. And I was still not sure if I wanted to be in this band or not. After meeting Glenn and Erie and, you know, the other guys, I was kind of, because I was, at the time, I don't know if you know, I was studying jazz music.
Mm-hmm.
And do you remember where I was studying? Did you know that one?
I do know that. I do know you were studying jazz. You're in Baltimore, right? Studying jazz? Yeah. What was the what was it?
At the time, it was called Towson State University.
Okay.
And I went there. My oldest sister graduated there, summa or cum laude, whatever, one of those cum laude things.
Sure.
And I knew they had a good program, and so the guitar program was so full of guitar players that I got in initially as a bass player.
Okay.
And I challenged exam my way in. I was studying at Catonsville with a graduate of Towson, and I said, hey, you know, what'll it take to get me in? And so he coached me up over a summer, and I went in, nailed it. I was behind in the theory and the sight singing and the music history and all that. I had to catch up for a couple semesters, but I ended up being a composition major, and my teacher and mentor was Hank Levy, the guy who wrote Whiplash.
Wow.
So that movie Whiplash,
yeah,
right, about that song, and the actors and everything, the guy who wrote that chart was my mentor, my teacher.
That's cool. That's great.
So I was studying with him when my buddy was nagging me about trying out for this punk band in New York, and I was like, dude, you know, I'm good. They're still looking for a guitar player. Now they're dealing with Rick Rubin, and I was like, Rick who? And they said, and because he wasn't a name yet.
Right.
Back then, I think Russell was a bigger name than Rick was at the time. And, he said, Beastie Boys, Run DMC, Aerosmith. And I was like, oh, so I started looking into it. And then he hit me up again over Christmas break. And I was like, all right, let's do it. And then, 2 months later, I had the final audition the night before my spring semester started. The very next day was my first class. I already had my dorm room, my roommates, all my stuff was over at college, ready to go, signed up for all my classes. And, I go in for the second audition, and I'm there early because I came up from Baltimore, and I'm in the studio, which was Top Cat, which was, I think, Tommy Hamilton's studio, or either Joey Kramer or Tommy Hamilton, 28th Street, Manhattan. They owned the studio. Aerosmith gear, all their old road gear was in the studios.
Wow.
Their old PAs and their old monitors and stuff, and Marshall stacks and everything. Cool. So it was cool. I'm playing on beat up Aerosmith gear. And so I was there early, and when the other musicians showed up for the audition, I just saw their body language. I knew I had the gig. Before anything even started, I knew I already had it, because I practiced, I dialed it in, I was ready to go, and I was more concerned about getting home to start school the next day. I was like, man, I just want to get this over with so I can go home. I almost wanted to get the gig so I could turn it down.
Right.
At that point, because Glenn had made it so difficult to get in touch with him. I was like, are you kidding me? This is ridiculous, But there are stories about that process, things that happened. But Rick was a lot of fun. When we got into the studio, he would rock back and forth, and he had this really long hair, and he knew what he was doing, because he focused on the drum beat, the groove.
Gotcha.
Everything was the feel. Everything was the groove. That was the core. That was the heartbeat.
Yeah.
And everything was gravy on top. So it was, guitar is important, and the riff and all that. It's got to have the right feel. But, the drum part and an amazing vocal performance, those are the two really key elements. The guitar riff can save a song, but it can't do everything if the other parts aren't there. I mean, you can have a great guitar part, and if the drummers aren't 100%, you might pull it off if you have an amazing vocal performance, right? Yeah. Guns N' Roses, perfect example.
Right.
Drums are okay, but they weren't Metallica, another one. Drums are there, but it's, all these wacky fills kind of pieced together into a part, right?
Yeah.
But there, the guitars are so solid and the vocals are just perfect, right?
Yeah.
Those two elements. Danzig, same thing, but we had three. We had a great drummer in Chuck Biscuits who just, he's an alien. He was what do we call him? Animal from the Muppets.
Yeah.
Because when you watched him play, it was just sweat and sawdust flying off the kit.
Wow.
Because he hit so hard, it was like, he would hit every snare drum hit. He did a rim shot, so he was hitting the stick on the rim of the snare at the same time he's hitting the head, and that's how he got that huge sound, whack, whack, whack. And sometimes he hit his knuckles instead of the stick, so his knuckles after every session or rehearsal were all swollen and bloody.
Wow.
That's the way he played. But when you put that together with the tone of the guitar and then Glenn's wailing vocals, that was boom.
That was it.
And then it was Rick's job to figure out, okay, where do we need to tighten up, polish this, that, and the other thing. But he was clear from the start. He wanted it raw. He wanted the band to sound like it did live on record.
Which is huge. That's huge.
But it was so dry, we couldn't stand it. Chuck and I were so disappointed at the tones. We didn't see the big picture. Because all the records that we were listening to were full of lush production and all this great stuff, and we're like, hey, what happened to my Ritz cracker?
Yeah.
I just got a saltine. I thought I was promised a Ritz.
Yeah, exactly.
But the contrast worked, and apparently that was enough. The raw energy is what I'm hearing from fans now. I'm amazed that 1988, that were impacted by it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And they're reaching out so many years later to let us know. I think it's amazing. I never would have expected that.